There are three ways to combine layers: grouping, linking, and merging. Combining layers means that for some operations, the combined layers act as a single layer. Open the file Combine1. It has 4 squares in it arranged in a checkered pattern. Each square is on a separate layer, as we typically do when we work with vector shapes. If we want to move the checkered pattern, we might use the Move tool to click on the upper left square and drag it. But just that square moves and not the others. Control Z to put it back. Layers can be combined temporarily just by selecting them. So to move all the squares together, select all the rectangle layers. In the Layer panel, clicking on an unselected layer selects that layer and deselects all the others. Control-clicking on an unselected layer adds that layer to the selection, and Shift-clicking on an unselected layer selects a range of layers. With all the layers selected, they can be moved as though they were a single layer. They can also be transformed as though they were a single layer too, for example, rotated. Click on the check mark to lock in the rotation. Of course, having to select every layer every time you want to combine them is pretty tedious, especially when the squares in this drawing are never really meant to live on their own. There are 3 ways to permanently combine layers. One we've already seen, grouping, but we will look at it a bit more closely now. Linking, which in effect makes a single layer but maintains the properties of each layer individually. The sledgehammer is merge, which literally makes a single layer out of multiple layers, with the side effect that some of the layers may have their properties changed. To start with, let's group the squares on the layers by selecting them. There are 3 different ways to make a group. Do a right mouse button on the layer in the group and choose Group from Layers. Or use the application menu, Layer Group Layers, or just press Ctrl G. That replaces the layers with a folder. The folder acts like a single layer in that if you select it, you can move and rotate the squares like a single layer. Keeping in mind that, as we saw earlier, if auto select is either off or set to group. Click the check mark to lock in the rotation. Properties like mode and opacity can be set on the folder. When a folder is selected, an additional blend mode becomes available called pass-through. When the mode is passed through, each layer is painted using the mode set for that layer. You can see this by selecting the Rectangle 1 layer and changing its mode to lighten, which makes that square disappear because the background layer is lighter than it is. Then select the folder for the group and set the mode to normal. This overrides the mode settings on the individual layers, so now the rectangle layer is painted as though it were in normal mode. The opacity on a folder acts as it does on a layer, however the fill affects both the stroke and fill on the layers in the group. A folder can also have masks. In fact, a folder can have both, or either, or neither, of course, a layer and a vector mask. You add a layer mask to a group folder in the same way you add one to a layer. Make a selection, then use the Alt Layer Mask icon. Now we have a porthole through the center of the square. Now remove the layer mask with a right click and remove layer mask. Note the folder we are working with has shape layers in it. Even though you cannot apply a vector mask to a shape layer, you can apply a vector mask to a folder containing shape layers. Just to show that it is possible, we will add a vector mask to the Squares folder. Select the Squares folder and Control-click on the mask icon. Do a right mouse button on the thumbnail for the mask, and you will see that it is a vector mask. Just to show that it actually works, we'll use the pen tool to make a vector-based mask. For now, we will just delete the mask. And a folder can be hidden or visible. If a layer in the group is already hidden, when the group is hidden, it will, of course, remain hidden. But when the group is made visible again, it will still remain hidden. A group can be deleted. Do a right mouse button on the Group 1 folder and choose Delete Group. You are given a choice of removing the folder and its contents, or just removing the folder and leaving the layers ungrouped. Choose Group Only so the layers are not removed. Grouping always results in layers that are adjacent to each other. To see this, select the Rectangle 1 and Rectangle 4 layers, then press Ctrl G to group them. Notice that the position of Rectangle 1 was moved up in the layer list to be next to Rectangle 4. Now delete that group and put the layers back in order. Another way to combine layers is to link them. The net effect is similar to grouping, but operationally it acts a bit differently. Open the Combine 2 drawing. It's basically the same as we started the previous example with. You link layers by selecting them and then use the right mouse button on one of the selected layers and choose Link Layers. You can also link layers using the application menu Layer Link Layers. When layers are linked and at least one of them is selected, a little piece of chain appears in the right-hand side of each of the linked layer entries in the Layers panel. Link the 4 layers together. Now select just one of them and a little piece of chain appears on all of them. Now select the background layer and the little pieces of chain go away. Clicking on one of the squares with the Move tool will select just that layer regardless of the auto select setting. However, moving one of the squares will move all of the others too, regardless of the auto select setting. Each layer maintains its own property, including blend mode, opacity, and fill. You can edit each of these individually. There are no overall settings for mode, opacity, and fill like there are in a group. Return all the layers to their original settings. In a group, if auto select is turned off or set to layer, you can move individual shapes. With linked layers, you have to turn off or disable its link to do this. To move the rectangle on the Rectangle 2 layer, select that layer, disable the link by shift-clicking on its chain icon, then use the Move tool to move it. Then shift-click on the chain icon again to relink it to the other layers. There can be more than one set of linked layers in a drawing, and linked layers do not need to be adjacent to each other. To see this, add a rectangle just above the background layer and another above all the layers. Now select both of those new layers and link them. Move one of the new rectangles and the other moves with it. Then select one of the original rectangles and move it. The other rectangles linked to it move too. Notice that the chain icon appears in different sets of layers depending on which layers are selected. In practice, for technical drawings, you will probably find grouping more useful than linking, except in the case where you want to combine layers that are not adjacent and maintain their position in the Layers panel. Grouping is a bit easier to see in the Layers panel too because you can roll up the layers into a folder, and you may find it useful to put masks on the group folder or adjust its opacity. And again, just for completeness, we will briefly look at the sledgehammer for combining layers, Merge. Open Combine 3, which is like the drawings we started the previous examples with. Merge combines the layers you select into a single layer. Select the 4 rectangle layers, do a right mouse button on one of them and select Merge Shapes. This merges the 4 layers into a single layer. Oops! What happened to the blue squares? The properties for a shape belong to the layer they are on, not to the shape itself. So when the layers were combined into a single layer, all the shapes had to end up with the same properties. Once you merge layers, there is no easy way to unmerge them, except undo, of course. You can move just one of the squares, but not with the tools we've looked at so far. You need to use the Path Selection tool to do this. We will be looking at that and some other vector tools when we look at custom shapes in a later video, but just for demonstration purposes, we'll use the Path Selection tool to move one of the squares. For technical drawings, it's hard to think of a case where merge would be more useful than group, but that functionality is there if you find the need for it. So to recap where we are with combining layers. You combine layers so you can work with them as though they were a single layer, for example, to move some shapes together rather than individually. For technical drawings, the most useful ways to do this are to either temporarily combine the layers by simultaneously selecting them, or permanently combining them by putting them into a group. Layers in a group can be managed individually or as a group. The group itself has a blend mode and opacity. A group can have either, both, or neither a vector mask or a layer mask. Structurally, a group is a folder that holds layers. You can also combine layers by linking or merging them. Linking is similar to grouping, but lacks overall layer properties like blend mode, opacity, and masks. Link does allow layers that are not adjacent to each other to be combined, which is the only feature of link layers that is not available to group layers. Merging layers uses a sledgehammer to cram multiple layers into a single layer. In doing so, the individual properties of the layers may be lost.